Good morning, Garrett.
Good morning, Noah. Great to be here with you.
Yeah, great to have you. I'm really excited to dive in today. Good morning, Whalecoin Talk community. I'm here with Garett Jones. He is macroeconomist at George Mason University. He's a chief economist at Blue Chip, the first stablecoin rating agency. We're going to talk about that, and we're definitely going to talk about the culture transplant, which Garett is an author of. So without further ado, Garett, can you give us a quick background of yourself? Tell us your origin story, how you ended up at George Mason, and kind of highlight some of the work that you've done before we dive in.
Yeah, well, I was born a Mormon boy in Southern California. And while I was knocking doors as a missionary one day, I decided that even though Mormons were great people, I didn't believe in the religion. And that's sort of part of my origin story. It's led to a lot of my intellectual journey. Just because people are nice and pull off a great community doesn't mean that their worldview is scientifically based. So there can be a gap between what's good to believe and what's true to believe. Anyway, eventually I became an economist, got an economics PhD, spent a little time working in the US Senate. And so that back and forth between policy work and economic thinking has been sort of part of my life. So I've written 3 books now, all with Stanford Press. I'm at the George Mason University Economics Department, which is a great place for real intellectual inquiry. And now I've taken on some work in the crypto community, helping to build Blue Chip with a great team. The first stablecoin rating agency has been a lot of fun. Taking academic ideas that have been sitting in books and just turning them into a new way to rate stablecoins the same way that Moody's and S&P rate corporate bonds.
So at what point did you realize, and Garrett, if you don't mind muting, it's just because there's a little bit, thank you. At what point did you realize you didn't believe in the religion? Like, was there a turning moment where you said, okay, something's not right here? Or was it something, was that kind of shift in your mentality over a period of time?
It was a shift. It was about a 6-month process, I'd say. Ultimately, it started just before my mission and ended in the middle of it. And the key thing for me was realizing that the ways of knowing in religion, in the LDS faith, just didn't actually work very well. First, it was me learning that the historical arguments for Mormonism's truthfulness weren't that compelling. The Book of Mormon is a very impressive book. It's still hard for me to imagine how a young boy in upstate New York could have written it, even with the help of others, maybe. But that by itself wasn't impressive enough to get me to believe a religion. So the historical evidence fell apart for me first. Then I tried to figure out whether internal, intuitive, spiritual experiences could be a good guide to truth, which is what a lot of religion is built on. And I decided that didn't work either. So it was about a 6-month process of first realizing that external facts couldn't prove these big claims, and then secondly, realizing that internal, spiritual, you might call intuitive experiences couldn't do that. That made the process of learning what was true and what was false a much more difficult journey. I found math at some point along the way. It was nice to learn that math gives you some real answers, but finding economic truths took a little longer.
And so finding economic truth and finding your truth came in the form of education, came in the form of getting a bachelor's degree, a master's degree. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, history turned out to be my path. As an undergrad, I ended up majoring in history. I talked with another student who just convinced me that history was a great way to learn actual facts. You go into archives, you start finding out what happened. You start realizing it's very unlikely that people made up all of these facts about, say, the United States Civil War happening. That sort of broad template of facts that shows up in so many different ways means that there are certain core truths about the world you can actually learn, right? So the radical skepticism that I had as a much younger person started vanishing once I dove into the archives. So history told me that there were real things I could learn, but history also told me that history alone was a terrible way to learn about causation. So history was great at the is, and it wasn't great at the why. So it was good at, I should say, what. History was great at what, but not why. And so ultimately, economic theory turned out to be a good tool for thinking about causation, partly because economists love these so-called natural experiments, and partly because we just get used to using this other things equal thinking. We call it ceteris paribus thinking. And it just means you start looking at the world as a series of potential natural experiments, and that helps you make a lot more headway with causation. The recent Nobel Prizes for the folks who invented the credibility revolution. A lot of work on causal inference. These folks are great. We often think of Card, Kruger, Josh Angrist as people who do great work in that area. Nailing down causation turned out to be a big quest of mine, and I think I've done it in some of my research.
Can you dive into what the credibility?
The credibility revolution.
Yeah, can you dive into that, please?
Yeah, sure. So the credibility revolution is this idea that beforehand in economics, a lot of us were trotting out correlations and saying maybe it's causation because I have a good story. So, we all know that correlation isn't causation, but we kind of like to know what causation is. And so the credibility revolution folks got us to look much more carefully at when we could really say something clear about causation. So a famous example involved the Vietnam draft lottery. So for a period during the Vietnam War, people were drafted based on just a pure numerical lottery. If your birthday got called, then you were eligible for the draft. And if your birthday didn't get called, then you weren't eligible. And so that meant that you could look at people. It was just like running, say, medical trials, where you have a treatment group and a control group. And so checking to see what was the effect of Vietnam War service on later labor market outcomes. That approach got economists looking for many, many more such natural experiments. So I remember seeing a paper in grad school that was about an earthquake in San Francisco randomly knocked down some freeway on-ramps, but not others. And so that helped us study how important freeway access was for labor market outcomes. Did people who lived far from a broken freeway out-ramp, off-ramp, not work for the next 6 months? So looking for natural experiments, sometimes government mistakes, sometimes true randomizations, things that are as close as possible to a scientific study with a control group and a treatment group. That's helped us make a lot of progress.
And is this sort of research what led you to write The Culture Transplant?
Well, so The Culture Transplant doesn't have any great purely natural experiments. We have some moderate and mediocre experiments, often created by the great horrors of the past. So when you want to understand why some countries are richer than others, and why some countries are poorer than others, you end up with this problem where you just don't have true experiments, right? We have the great example of North Korea versus South Korea, right? Where the Soviet tanks stopped has created a lot of natural experiments. And that's how we learned that basically, totalitarian communism is not a great way to run a country. That's kind of close to an experiment. The Culture Transplant looks at something like an experiment, but it's not perfect. So for instance, I start off by looking at this question that we've cared about. Do people bring their cultures from one country to another? And so we have something like an experiment where we can look at Italian Americans and compare them to Italians in Italy. We can look at Swedish Americans and compare them to Swedes in Sweden. We can look at Mexican Americans and compare them to Mexicans in Mexico, along different traits like savings behaviors and attitudes toward trust and what they think the government should do. It's not a perfect experiment, but we can look at the second and third and fourth generations often with these folks, and we can see if people who don't really have a strong tie to that country still have attitudes a lot like their home country. So it's a little like an experiment. And the Culture Transplant documents this in quite a few different ways, just reporting the research of famous people like Harvard's Alberto Alesina. And so the experiment of migration has let us find out that migrants carry attitudes from their old countries to their new ones and pass them on to their children and grandchildren.
And do you guys have metrics to what degree migrants come and kind of shift culture within societies and shift voting, kind of like voting trends within societies?
Well, I can give a great example of this where migration really helped improve American institutions, and it's an internal migration. It's the Great Migration of African Americans from the South to the North in the middle of the 20th century. So as your listeners know, as almost all of your listeners know, African Americans in the South almost could very rarely vote. Extremely low rates of voting in the South because of the racist Jim Crow rules. And so when African Americans migrated to the North in the mid 20th century, most of them were able to vote, not universally. Local politicians paid attention to this in the North. And when large numbers of African American voters moved in and began voting, politicians in this competitive political market, they started moving and supporting more civil rights legislation, using the rules of Congress to try to move civil rights bills onto the floor. And they appeared to change the attitudes of other white voters. That shows up in polling data. So parts of the country where large numbers of African Americans moved, white voters became more sympathetic to civil rights, the civil rights movement. So that's a great example, and I think it's well documented across history and economics, where migration changed political attitudes for the better. And I think it's a lesson we can draw from to learn more generally that migration can create a culture transplant.
How does migration impact markets? Yeah.
There, I point to the example of Chinese migration across Southeast Asia. As Amy Chua of Yale has pointed out, she's created this term to describe when groups move from one country to another and become very economically successful. She calls them market dominant minorities. And across Southeast Asia, not just Singapore, but Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, the Philippines, Chinese migrants who've moved from China to other countries in Southeast Asia for the last 2 centuries have really become key entrepreneurial figures disproportionately. Since this isn't everybody, of course, but disproportionately, they've helped to improve the economies of these countries. They're disproportionately represented among billionaires, among highly productive industries, among internationally trading manufacturing firms. And this is a sign that high-skilled migration from countries that have historical economic success can really help to improve a nation's economic performance. I think a lot of the poorest countries in the world could do really well by embracing high-skilled immigration and by embracing immigration from societies that have long-term experiences with great successes. There's a great book called China's Second Continent I can recommend by a New York Times reporter that shows about how Chinese migration to sub-Saharan Africa on a much smaller scale is still having noticeable effects on local economies and making things better.
I saw a clip of you talking about, just piggybacking off of that last point, Iceland having open borders. Can you dig into why that would be a good thing and why that would be a good experiment for advocating other countries to open their borders that traditionally don't have their borders open?
Yes. So the open borders movement is a movement to say that it should be as easy to move from one country to another, almost as easy to move from one country to another as it is to move from New Mexico to Texas or from Iowa to Missouri. Within the U.S., we don't have internal borders. Within most of Western Europe, there aren't many internal borders. Migrating across any country should be just about that easy. And there are a lot of concerns about what would happen if we did that. And my concern is that there are just 7 countries in the world that produce most of the world's great ideas. I call them the I-7. The US is one of them. China is one of them. And open borders is a risky experiment that could have possible negative long-run consequences. So if we're going to run that experiment, we should run it in a place where that isn't producing that many of the world's great ideas. And Iceland is one of them. Iceland's a great place. I recommend going there. I've been there once. But there's only about 300,000 people there. And it's the size of Kentucky. So it's the size of a medium-sized U.S. state. And if you just looked at what would happen if Iceland got as dense as Singapore, they could have 1 billion people there. So I don't mean this as a literal example, but I do think that it's a reminder that if we're going to have open borders experiments, it's great to run them in places that are not central to the world's innovative potential, that aren't central to the world's patenting and R&D and scientific research, but a place with good institutions where people would be nice to them. So let's run this open borders experiment in Iceland and see where it goes from there.
Why not have open borders to a country that drives innovation, that's a powerhouse? Like, I'm thinking of immigrants from places like India, where there are a lot of brilliant minds that could come in and help beef up that powerhouse and drive innovation even more.
Well, I think that's a good case for highly skilled immigration, and it's a case for having highly educated workers come in and be able to migrate very freely. So basically expanding H-1B type programs for the US where skilled migrants come in and are able to get residency and within a few years be able to vote and help improve our democracy, I hope. Um, there's a very reasonable case for that. It's worth debating the precise details of it, but in particular for the U.S., if we're worried about keeping Social Security and Medicare running for a long time, it'd be great to have a lot of migrants who are clearly net fiscal contributors. Clearly, over the long run, they and their descendants are likely to pay more in taxes than they take in benefits. And for highly skilled migrants, that's really likely to be true. So a high skilled immigration program could be a great way to have nearly open borders for people with very high skilled levels. Maybe you have to have a limit of 10, 15 million a year, whatever limit you want to impose. But making a bigger America, making a bigger UK, making a bigger France through highly skilled immigration over the long run is, I think, a great policy.
And how do we choose which countries, let's say, with respect to the U.S., which countries we want to encourage immigration from and which countries we don't? Isn't that gonna how am I phrasing this? Isn't that gonna upset some people?
Yeah, I mean, so you might not want to. The question is, do you want to actually care about the countries folks come from at all? So, I personally don't believe in sort of quotas or strict off and on rules like toggle switches. I'm not a toggle switch guy. What I think we should use is something more like what Australia, New Zealand, Hong Kong, Singapore, places like that have used, which is a points-based program. It's a little bit like getting into college, right? Where there shouldn't be a strict SAT cutoff or a strict GPA cutoff. Instead, you just want to kind of have a portfolio of information about a person. And so on a points-based system, I think that giving most of the weight to these skill measures like degrees of education that's where I put most of the weight. And you also might want to put much smaller amount of weight on whether the person comes from a country that's had an operating democracy for the last century or two, an operating well-run legal systems for the last century or two, just to get some idea of whether someone comes from a culture that has experience with success. It's not that I would never make that most of the story or all of the story, but giving a little bit of weight in any kind of points-based system toward you came from a culture that has a lot of experience with good institutions that we could use more of in our country. I think that deserves some small weight, but I put most of the weight on typical education measures and whether the person's done a long stint in prison for violent crimes.
Do you think the ultimate goal is to just have open borders across most nations, or rather not the ultimate goal, but do you think that would be a net positive?
No, I don't think it would be. I think that the risks to the I-7s, these innovative countries' institutional quality, is a big enough risk that a prudent person focused on the long run would say, let's not do that. Let's make sure we just don't know enough about how the world works to take that kind of risk. So maybe a century from now, an AI will tell us we worked out all the simulations and it looks like it's a great bet to have open borders, and maybe that'll be the time to implement it. But until then, we should be thinking in experimental terms. I think that in the world of medicine, it's good to operate with experiments. I think that the horrors of communism gave us a chance to run experiments on different economic institutions, and so we should use this sort of crossing the river by feeling the stones approach. We can tinker and experiment more to learn about how the world works rather than jumping into utopian schemes.
Garett, there seems to be, and maybe this is my anecdotal experience, what I am noticing around me, but there seems to be a rise, especially amongst people that are Gen Zs or young millennials, in this kind of wanting for a communist ideology to come back. Why doesn't communism work? Why has it never worked?
Well, I think that the risks of communism, I think that the risks to the I-7s, these innovative countries' institutional quality, is a big enough risk that a prudent person focused on the long run would say, let's not do that. Give a little bit of weight in any kind of points-based system toward you came from a culture that has a lot of experience with good institutions that we could use more of in our country. I think that's
Hello?
I think the best argument for why communism doesn't really work is Hayek's argument, Friedrich Hayek, Nobel laureate, that you know market-based systems draw in the knowledge that all of us have about what's going on in our local time and place, and the market tries to find ways through the invisible hand to pull information out of hidden spaces and make it public. Communism, the idea of centrally planned economic systems, just doesn't work because it loses the power of competition and it loses the power to pull out knowledge from the hidden away places in the economy. If someone, the old saying that if you build a better mousetrap, the world will beat a path to your door. The reason that's true is because you can just tell people, hey, I have a better mousetrap, and you don't need to persuade the Department of Mousetraps that you're right. You just need to persuade like 10, 20 people in your neighborhood. And then they'll persuade 10 or 20 people more, and so on. So basically, markets take advantage of decentralized knowledge and the ability to just sell an idea locally without having to convince the Department of Mousetraps that you've built a better mousetrap.
Understood. And one last question kind of on this topic, but tell us what you think about China's future. Do you think they're going to remain a powerhouse and keep growing?
Well, I think if they can avoid making historical errors of the scope that they made during, say, the Cultural Revolution, and if they don't make the mistake of doing something like launching a years-long destructive war to take over Taiwan, they have very good prospects for the medium term. I think that if there's one thing we've learned in economics, it's that countries often turn out like the countries economically that they're close to and that they're geographically close to. So we call that spatial autocorrelation in statistics. And so I would predict that if China's rapid growth of the last 30 or 40 years would basically keep going, and it would start looking a lot more like South Korea, a lot more like Taiwan, a lot more like Hong Kong. So China is currently the world's poorest majority Chinese country. And I think that it's closing that gap every year. And if they don't make the mistakes that they could make over the next couple of years, someday in the next 30, 40 years, they might turn out about as rich as Taiwan, the country that lost the Civil War.
And what about the U.S.? Do you think we're going to continue on the trajectory that we've been on over the last 200 years? Paradigm shifting innovations coming out of this country, and our growth, or is our growth kind of stifling and we need to find out different ways to pivot?
Well, in the US, it's very easy to build things with bits, and it's hard to build things with sticks, right? This is a point that Ezra Klein was making just the other day in the New York Times, that it's hard to build things in America. Government regulations make it harder and harder over time. Mansur Olson, who would have won a Nobel, economist, he said that basically countries get sclerotic over time. They get like a kind of economic hardening of the arteries. And the US seems to be getting a lot of that. So it's no surprise that our real innovations have happened in the world of computer programming, where you don't need a government regulator to approve your plan to build a bridge or to expand your factory. I think this sclerosis is a real problem. The problem is that we also may be the cleanest dirty shirt in the world. It's not like anybody else is doing much better on this. The world of bits is a place where we're going to keep growing. It's not surprised that AI is this huge breakthrough. It's also not a surprise that after 1 year of great innovation with COVID vaccines, innovation there has slowed down. Making things in the real world's hard across the rich countries now. Making things in the world of bits. Hopefully we can find great things in the world of bits, because that's where we're allowed to innovate right now.
I do want to talk about AI, but first I want to talk about when you kind of discovered crypto, or rather when you started looking at crypto and thinking, okay, well, this is something that is going to be around and it's worth learning more about, and how that led you into your chief economist role at Blue Chip.
Yeah, actually, I learned about it from my students here at George Mason. George Mason unit students we have a lot of people who are in the broader libertarian and anarchist communities. And as some of your listeners know, those folks were early adopters of Bitcoin. They knew about Satoshi early on. And so, that got me thinking about it at an early point in time. I I wish I'd bought $1,000 of Bitcoin when the first time I heard about it from them. So, and so that got me thinking quickly. I mean, I just pulled out normal economic reasoning to evaluate what was likely to happen with cryptocurrencies. And I quickly concluded that Bitcoin itself would not wind up as a stable store of value, that that was very unlikely to happen. And the reason why is because I know about how hard it is to manage to keep a stable exchange rate if you're a normal country. Most countries really struggle to keep the value of their currencies stable against, say, the US dollar. And I didn't see any plan for how Bitcoin could pull that off. We know in economics that the best way to keep your currency stable is to have a big pile of gold backing it. And so that's why I figured very quickly that only asset-backed stablecoins would be the most reliable path to creating a cryptocurrency that would say hold its value against the dollar. So anyway, basically that just got me writing about it a little bit theoretically, mostly on Twitter. And that led to me getting a chance to talk with the folks at Reserve, who created a stablecoin project that's now at reserve.org. I consulted with them quite a few years ago, and that brought me in on the inside a bit. And then after a few years of not being in contact with them, Nevin Freeman, the CEO of Blue Chip, just emailed me and said, "Hey, I'm thinking the world needs a stablecoin rating agency. And now I have a little free time to think about it." So that got us talking. And we have a small team that is Blue Chip. There's 3 of us. We'll be launching in Q2 of this year with ratings for about 24 of the most prominent stablecoins, with more to come. We're going to be issuing simple ratings as well as long reports and some technical analysis. So, and it's all like my role is basically exporting the information from normal economics about how do you run a good bank, how do nations keep their currency stable, and the rest of my team is figuring out how to translate that into the data on the ground in the world of crypto.
Is the rating system going to be live or going to go live anytime in the near future?
Oh yeah, Q2 is when we're launching. So it's somewhere in that April, May, June window where we'll be live with all of our reports, and we're using a rating scale that looks like American grades, from Fs all the way to potentially A pluses. I don't think anybody's going to be getting an A plus. Personally, that's just my judgment. So yeah, we'll have information available for everyone.
Do you have a list off the top of your head of the stable coins you guys plan on rating?
No, I don't off the top of my head, but they're the big ones, right? If you just go by market cap, we'll be looking at what you'd expect: Tether and Frax and USDC, and a lot of the rest. So we just want the ones that we think that are widely used and have a use case as stable coins. So, and part of our goal is that by putting out the ratings and our framework, a lot of it will be do it yourself, right? So all of our user base can actually do more ratings on their own, or they can critique our ratings. So our goal is to be really transparent about and explain how we come to our conclusion, to tell people our rubric, and show people our white paper. And so they can say, "Oh, we think you're a little wrong on this," or "We think you're too optimistic or too pessimistic about that one," by your own standards. So we really want to create a debate about what safety looks like. And I want to just bring a lot of great economic ideas and export them to the stablecoin community.
So give me your personal thoughts on Tether. I've been in this space since 2017, and Tether FUD has been a constant, and it just never goes away. People are always telling me that Tether's going to explode, and it's not backed. And I would love to hear your thoughts, since you are spearheading this campaign.
Yeah, so this will be just my personal view, not the view of Blue Chip. But the Tether case is really interesting, right? Because the FUD out there has grounding to it, right? I mean, Tether appears to have, by some measures, it looks like Tether has a ton of reserves, and they really are reserves, and it's not made up, right? On the other hand, do they have fully audited financial statements that are approved by a major accounting agency? No. So they're in this gray area of credibility. But at the same time, the fact that there is the real world experience that they've made it through all of the big runs and the big panics of the last few years while still holding their value. So this is maybe a case where nothing succeeds like success. So it's they're a very interesting case where a formal accounting based approach would say no, this has to be pretty high risk. And yet the market test, which should matter to a lot of us, to an economist like me, says, wow, they've done really well. So somewhere between there is where I come down. It's passing the market test counts for a lot in the real world. And when the theory doesn't fit the facts, sometimes I should move in the direction of the facts.
I love that. Garett, what about Frax? It's the first fractional reserve stablecoin, and I haven't dove too deep into it, but ever since the Terra Luna collapse, a lot of folks have been telling me that they would just rather stay away from anything that is fractional reserve or isn't backed one to one or isn't at least backed by a stable asset such as gold or basket of assets such as gold.
Yeah, that's another great case, right? So on the one hand, it does seem as though if someone is overwhelmingly concerned with long run stability, if I'm giving advice to widows and orphans, yes, I would strongly suggest that if you need to hold a stable coin, Frax is not going to be your choice, right? So the widows and orphans advice is going to be stick with something that's fully backed, as close to government regulated as you can. This is by a rich, successful, high law and order country. But so to turn to Frax, Frax sounds like it's operating like a normal bank, right? So the term means it's fractional reserve. They're telling you right there in their name, we are not keeping 100% reserves. We're partly backed by loans. And that's the way traditional banks have worked. And so Frax to me represents sort of the embodiment of like a decent version of 19th century American banking before the government was out there regulating and backing all of this stuff. They're trying to make their currency stable the old-fashioned way by loaning to people who seem pretty credible and having assets out there that they can sell to third parties in the event of a run. That's sort of what libertarians and historians will call the free banking approach to stability. So Frax is again an interesting experiment that's in this in between range. They're openly clear about the fact that they're not 100% backed, and but the things that they're backed by might be reliable. So in an ecosystem over 20 or 30 years, I think some things like Frax will do well. I also think that over an ecosystem lasting 20 or 30 years, some things like Frax will collapse and get into an old-fashioned bank run. In a pretty good outcome, what you wind up with is sometimes there'll be runs, but you'll get paid back 90 cents on the dollar within 6 months. That's sort of that strikes me as a reasonable scenario when we have 20 or 30 Fraxes in the ecosystem. That things like that will happen every once in a while. So yeah, Frax is again hard to evaluate. Personally, I put it in a little riskier approach than Tether because their business model is a little weirder. But promising because it has good historical roots. Nobody here is reinventing the wheel, even though, so basically, aside from the computer programming questions, nothing happening in the world of crypto is new. It's old lessons can teach us something about the now.
I'd say that cryptography is the paradigm shift, and I'm certainly looking forward to looking at the ratings in Blue Chip and seeing how you rank these stable coins. I know the ones that I like, and I have reasons for liking them. In USDC, BUSD, the form or the latter people don't recognize is actually issued by Paxos, and highly regulated stablecoin issuer in I believe New York City. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. I wanted to ask you about the total crypto market capitalization over the last 10 years. It's gone up if you zoom out, and would love to know what your thoughts are on the future of this industry. I understand that you like stable coins. You said that Bitcoin is not meant to be a stable asset, or it's not going to be a stable asset, and that's been very obvious. But its growth has been so far upward. So what do you think about Bitcoin's growth, and what do you think about the overall cryptocurrency market capitalization over the next 10 years?
Yeah, It was Megan McArdle, Washington Post columnist, who said that for the rich countries, it's hard to figure out what the use case is for cryptocurrency overall, right? Is it basically, you know, if cryptocurrency as the whole market cap ends up being sort of a new form of investing in art, a new form of investing in mementos, a new form of investing in, say, memorabilia, something you can hand from one person to another that has some kind of recognizable market value. It seems like that could just keep growing, and should keep growing because A, human beings appreciate novelty, and B, there's at least some demand for anonymous transactions everywhere, both in rich countries and poor countries. So I can't tell you what the right market cap is for the world as a whole, but as the world keeps getting richer, the proportion, at least the scale of crypto market cap to world wealth, that ratio should stay the same. So if world wealth keeps growing, I'd expect that the crypto market cap would keep growing at the same rate on average. So that's my best guess, is that this is a new way for people to hold and transmit wealth. People love being able to tell stories about their forms of wealth. That's part of the reason people get interested in buying paintings and sculpture, weird works of art. And so crypto has all of the elements that make it part of the portfolio of extremely wealthy people, which means there's always going to be a sizable demand for it.
People like to tell stories about their wealth. I never thought of it that way. So you said that a strong asset is typically, or rather a stable asset is one that's typically backed by a basket of goods, including gold. Do you ever see, as Bitcoin becomes less volatile, that a strong asset would be one that's backed by a basket of goods that also includes Bitcoin?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I don't think particularly gold has historically worked as a part of a backing system, right? So this is all going off Tom Sargent's idea, Nobel laureate. If you want good monetary policy, you need good fiscal policy. You need good tax and spending policy. It does seem as though the reason to not have Bitcoin in a backing portfolio is because it's just so doggone volatile, right? So unless you have some stable coins that are some cryptocurrencies that are negatively correlated with Bitcoin, it's unlikely that Bitcoin is going to be part of a stable portfolio unless it's massively over collateralized. I think that it makes it a tough case. Something that volatile is usually not a good asset for backing a currency. Think of how banks back their portfolios. It's mostly they're backing it with bonds from reliable folks, housing investments, which aside from 2008 are pretty reliable. So banks back their assets, banks back their deposits with a bunch of pretty safe assets. And Bitcoin would be a big step up in volatility for any kind of financial portfolio.
So I'd argue that Ethereum is what gave birth to so many of these stablecoins and so much of the infrastructure that we see today. And a lot of the stablecoins that are going to be rated on blue chip are ERC20 based. What are your thoughts on Ethereum and its future?
Yeah, I think I'm sympathetic to Eli Dorado's point from a few years ago, which is that he's an Ethereum maximalist. That basically the software that is so easily integrated into this ERC20 ecosystem is really crucial to making crypto achieve its real potential. And partly this is just because Vitalik and his team just put in this enormous amount of effort. They're just committed to the project. It's a reminder that basically you need great people on a team. You need great people committed to a project over the long haul to get things done in the real world. So looking for reliable teams is going to be a crucial part, I think, of evaluating stable coins, cryptocurrency projects. Memes can only get you so far. Ultimately, you need somebody who's going to act like the firefighter who gets up at 2 a.m. when the alarm goes off. And the Ethereum team seems to have that.
Hey, you've had some great analogies over the course of this broadcast. Garett, how do you see the global economy changing over the next? I know this is a broad question, but how do you see the global economy really changing and shifting over the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, I'd say part of it is we can't tell how AI is going to change things, but it does seem like it's going to change things a lot for a lot of knowledge workers. It's going to really create the kind of radical changes in knowledge work that tractors created in the farming world, and it's going to happen faster. So we're going to see a lot of churn in the world of office labor over the next 5 to 10 years. And some people are going to be made redundant, and they're going to start, a lot of people are going to start trying to find ways to switch from learning to code to learning to cut hair. And the world of production is going to continue to move away from China, as China, partly because China is getting richer and people want to work in offices rather than in factories as they get richer, and partly because supply chain disruptions over the last few years in China from COVID make businesses uncertain about this, as well as just the geopolitical concerns. So the move of a lot of production to Southeast Asia, particularly to countries that have substantial Chinese immigrant communities, that's going to keep happening. So I'd say those are the two big things that I keep an eye on. I could talk about natural resources as well, but I don't know what's going to happen enough with the world of energy and solar and batteries. We'll have to see what Elon says today.
Mm-hmm. And this brings me to my final point, or rather the final topic I wanted to discuss with you is AI. We've already seen the astronomical rise in users just with ChatGPT alone, and you've alluded to a few paradigm shifts that are going to be impacted, or rather they're going to happen as a result of AI. But let's dive a bit deeper. How do you see AI really transforming the fabric of society and the way that human beings interface with the world on a daily basis? And again, this is a question with a broad answer, but I would love to hear your thoughts, because I know you've done talks on this and you've made tweets on AI before. It's an industry that really excites me, and I'm already seeing how AI tools are making my life easier when it comes to so many different just not to go into it, but there's so many different ways that I'm seeing AI tools make my life easier.
Yeah, I think AI is changing the way humans interact with technology in a super fast way, right? We've never seen an app with this big an uptake as ChatGPT has experienced, right? So people from a wide variety of areas are using it. I know business people who are using it quickly to draft minutes, to draft business plans, super quickly. I have a friend who uses it to find somebody to talk about modern philosophy with, because none of his friends want to talk about modern philosophy. And ChatGPT just does a good job talking about this. It's basically an instant friend. So both in the socialization worlds, automating routine business activities, and as it's being integrated into the software world, so many questions we'd like to answer will be answerable within seconds rather than hours, as artificial intelligence automates these electronic tasks quickly. So a lot of people who want answers will be able to get them quickly. One thing to remember is that ChatGPT right now is basically built for likes. It's built to give customers what they want. And so that's not the same as getting the truth. So being built for likes is different from being built for truth. And so it will help empower people to get a version of what they want. And so that's going to bring more of what people want into the marketplace of ideas and into the genuine economic marketplace. And I think it will ramp up the quality of products that we see on offer. And as long as consumers are in charge of their choices, I think that means a lot better choices for consumers. Yeah. You've already seen automating the programming process, right? Everyone who keeps track of tech Twitter sees that. Once you can be doing it quickly with software for statistics, artificial intelligence for movies, this is going to be there's going to be some fantastic technology over the next few years. I just hope that the AIs don't make it too easy for angry teenagers to build bioweapons.
God, that's a rabbit hole we can go down. So, can you expand upon built for truth? What do you mean by that exactly? And can you give some examples?
Yeah. So, it's the AIs are not starting with an epistemic model. It's basically, it's built around creating responses that its users like, and they're like the median user is not doesn't know the truth on a lot of questions. The median user is trying to find out the truth, right? So the median user gives positive feedback to the AI, when it gets an answer that feels good rather than an answer that is good. This goes back to what I said at the beginning about me leaving Mormonism, right? I was really interested in not what felt good, but in what was true. And that the current wave of AIs, which will change in the next 6 months, the current wave of AIs aren't using the epistemic tools of, say, the rationalist movement to weigh the statements it's providing us with, right? And I think that's a problem for those of us who are interested in getting the right answer. Like, I would love an AI that just checks its own claims against the basic tools of the best epistemology that I personally agree with. A skeptical, evidence-driven approach that looks for internal inconsistencies. So, and that's what we lack right now.
Do you foresee a future where AI becomes sentient and we have robots that are free thinking living amongst us?
Well, I think AIs are already a lot more sentient than many of us. So, I still really don't know what sentience is, right? This is the sort of whole consciousness and qualia question of philosophy that I gave up on a long time ago. I do think that one thing we should ask ourselves is, from the point of view of the typical, and I think the answer to that is definitely yes. And I think that means it'll make it pretty tough for a lot of people across the rich world to do things like, say, deny voting rights to these AIs after a while. My colleague Robin Hanson thought about this in his book, The Age of M, which I think is the best speculation on this topic. But eventually, a lot of these AIs will seem human enough to people that will wonder, why aren't we giving this person a right to vote? Some AIs really will wind up on corporate boards pretty soon with voting rights, maybe just one, maybe just two at a time. But over time, I think it's going to be hard to not feel like we're talking with people, and sometimes people who are better than us and sometimes people who are worse than us.
How soon are we talking? What do you speculate?
Oh, yeah. 2.5 years before people think having an honest to God AI on a corporate board evaluating decisions and being given some voting rights, that'll seem very normal as an option in 2.5 years. Yeah, I can't imagine not doing it, because, like, look at who's on boards now, right? You get a lot of smart people who have a wide variety of backgrounds, a wide variety of perspectives, but who are not core experts in the field. You sometimes keep these board members around just to have them around to be, frankly, bullshit detectors. And within a year or two, it'll be really clear that an AI can be a pretty good bullshit detector, and that means it's somebody you'd want on a corporate board.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Garett, what are some classes that you teach at George Mason? I wanted to learn more about that, and also learn about whether or not people who aren't students at the university are able to come and audit your classes.
Yeah, well, I'm always happy to have students come in and sit in as guests in my classes. There's always plenty of room, as long as I'm not breaking any fire code rules. I love teaching public choice, which is basically economic models of politics. A lot of my colleagues help build this field. Public choice is about treating, just thinking about politics the same way we think about markets. We think that firms are competitive and trying to get market share. Similarly, we think politicians are competitive and trying to boost their chances of re-election. And this approach, this sort of skeptical, kind of pessimistic approach to politics, ends up yielding a lot of great insights. I also teach long-run economic growth. I teach macro, big picture stuff about the economy with focus on economic growth. I really want to find out why some countries are richer than others, why sometimes periods grow faster than others, what kind of economic rules of the game are better and worse. And there's been a lot of great research in this area, and I'm glad I got to learn it. I'm glad I got to contribute to it. I also teach some monetary economics too. That was where my dissertation was on, about the Fed and whatnot. So monetary economics, long-run economic growth, models of politics, some evidence on politics. That's what I love teaching. GMU is a great place to do it. We have a lot of smart people around. If you just look at who my colleagues are, if people look online, they'll find that there are a lot of great people with outside-the-box ideas that have had a big effect on the world.
I speak for myself, as well as I'm sure others in the audience, but going to ask you the question again. Not students, but can people from the general public that live in Virginia audit some of these classes? Because I think these are very interesting topics, and you're very well versed in them. I mean, I'm really enjoying listening to you speak about just some of the things that we've discussed over the course of this broadcast.
Oh yeah, definitely. People who are nearby are totally welcome to come into my class. I know other colleagues of mine have made the same offer. I actually just was talking with someone the other day who's now a professional in DC, and he said that he sat in on one of my classes, one of my graduate classes when he was an undergrad. And so, yeah, there's no reason for people in the general public not to just look up and see when and where I'm teaching my classes at George Mason and show up. So this semester, I just teach a Thursday night class in the Arlington campus. Yeah, people are totally welcome to come in and ask me Q&A during the breaks or after class. I think sharing economic ideas is really, it's one of the great gifts that I'm able to give others, because economists have built a lot over the last 2 centuries, and it should be shared more.
I think it's safe to say, Garett, that you're a scholar and you've done quite a bit as far as studying history and studying the past. There's a saying that if you study the past, then you can define the future. What excites you most about the future?
I think that the prospect of technology freeing people from suffering and making it easier for people to have just the best experiences possible is really fantastic. Sometimes I call myself a civilizationist. I think that the great things that human beings have done, what justifies our existence on this planet, is the very best things we've done regarding art, regarding literature, regarding great human experiences. Other animals have great family experiences, great emotional experiences with their intimates, with their intimate ones in their circle. They have friends and whatnot. Human beings have this ability to interact on a large scale, to experience complexities of emotion through art, through music, that as far as we can tell, no other animal can. Those peak experiences are what should be shared. I think technology is going to make it possible for us to share those with each other and in our own personal minds. And I'm looking forward to more of that in the next century.
So when you say the prospect of technology freeing people from suffering, is one example, let's say AI and robots making time for humans to do human things, typically tedious tasks that people are wasting hours and hours of their day on, will be freed up, or rather will be supplemented by automation, and then those hours can be used towards exactly what you just stated, right? Having complex connections with others through art, through music, through literature. Is that one example?
Yes, I absolutely agree. Like, basically, technology has freed people from drudgery in so many ways over the last 2 centuries, which we can document in a clear way. And people really value this. When you look at what it is that people are choosing to do as they switch jobs over time, they're basically choosing less and less miserable jobs. I have a colleague who grew up in a poor, lower middle income country, and he said that in the environment he grew up in, you knew you had a great job if you could get a job where you had air conditioning at the office, right? And that's something that so many of us take for granted now. My father had to work outdoors all the time. He's a pipe fitter. He worked in dangerous settings all the time. People choose, as they get richer, to avoid drudgery and avoid misery and avoid risk and discomfort. And so just getting people that bare minimum is something technology is excellent at. And obviously, if technology can make it so that I don't have to spend 3 hours cleaning my data set just to do a simple analysis, that's reducing drudgery for me. So this technology eliminating drudgery is something that A, has happened, and B, people vote with their feet to show that they value it. We're going to get more of that in the next century, as long as we don't blow ourselves up.
As long as we don't blow ourselves up. Do you see that as an actual possibility?
Yes, it does seem one way or the other. Humans tend to use the weapons that are around, and the risks of whether it's large scale nuclear exchange or some other kind of catastrophe really knocking human beings back hundreds of years is always a live risk, right? Is that 0.1% a year? Is it 1% a year? Either way, if you compound those risks out over a century, it's too big to ignore. And finding ways to minimize those catastrophic risks is something that some of the best utilitarian thinkers have thought about. The Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford has done good work on this. But trying to avoid the great catastrophes is something we should really be thinking about.
I'm going to put because we're coming towards the end of the broadcast here, I'm going to put my Joe Rogan tinfoil hat on and ask you this question. Do you think that advanced civilizations, much more advanced than ours, have existed thousands and thousands of years in the past before, and they kind of came to a point where they did blow themselves up and set civilization back hundreds of thousands of years, and we have to start over again?
I think the reason I would reject that is because we would have found the evidence by now. There would be people leave residue, like civilizations leave some kind of residue, and I would have found some kind of evidence of this by now. I heard once a very speculative, a wildly crazy speculation about this. Like, how would we find out if the dinosaurs had done something so many millions of years ago, right? What if they had a civilization that would have gotten destroyed? And the speculative answer was, well, the way we should check is we should go up to the moon and check. If they got to the moon, they would have left some residue there that would be, buried under the dirt. So my guess is the fact that we haven't found it on Earth and we haven't seen signs of it really reduces my likelihood of it. Although, something in the dinosaur era, you absolutely can't rule out, right? That was so long ago that any residue would have been eliminated.
I could so take this down a rabbit hole, and I'm going to be cognizant of your time here, Garett. Maybe save it for another broadcast, or maybe save it for a cup of coffee sometime. We are pretty close to each other, so we'd be down to link up. You wrote The Culture Transplant, and you mentioned you had written 2 other books. What are those books for our audience members, if you could share those? I think you might be muted.
Oh, yeah. One book is Hive Mind, How Your Nation's IQ Matters So Much More Than Your Own. There's a review of that in the Wall Street Journal you can find. And 10% Less Democracy, Why You Should Trust Elites a Little More and the Masses a Little Less. That was reviewed at The Economist if people want to see more. So I call these 3 books my Singapore trilogy, because Singapore, a great country, plays an important role in all of them.
Yeah, Singapore is doing a lot of things right. So with respect to Hive Mind, is that kind of the tie into the saying that you're the average of the 5 people you spend most of your time with, right? You're only as good as the IQ of the country that you're living in, the aggregate IQ.
Yeah, basically being around smart people is a lot more important than being smart yourself. And partly that's because it's a sort of Adam Smith story where you need teams to get things done on a big scale. Humanity's great projects have all been about team cooperation. So overcoming these hurdles that keep us from working together is important to taking on big tasks. And intelligence, or human capital or education, however you want to think about it, that seems to be a key correlate of being able to take on big tasks. That's where economic progress comes from, not from individual. I mean, yes, you need a Newton to come up with the great ideas of physics, or an Einstein. But to implement those at scale, you need teams of engineers, and those teams need to be able to cooperate. Cooperation is central to human prosperity.
10% less democracy, why you should trust elites a little more and the masses a little bit less. Does that mean, and again, this is a long book that probably really goes into the complexities of all this, but just tying it to an example, the people who are the elites are there for a reason, and the people that are the masses are the masses for a reason. I'm generalizing here. Is that why people should trust the elites a little bit more and the masses a little bit less?
Well, I mean, there are obviously many elites that are destructive and evil and terrible. But across, say, the richest, most productive countries in the world today, all of our governments have some role for elites, and we like that. I mean, I'm glad that the U.S. House of Representatives does not set interest rates. I'm glad it's left to the Federal Reserve. I'm glad that our judicial decisions are left to judges who have lifetime jobs, who can't be voted out when people get mad at them. So some parts of what we call democracy are kept pretty far away from the voters, and that's a good thing. I don't want the voters to have no role in democracy. I want them to have a lot. But handing some things over to some experts, whether it's the firefighters making decisions about when to knock the house down, the Federal Reserve deciding on interest rates, or the judges deciding on who's going to the electric chair, these questions sometimes should just be left away, kept at arm's length from the voters.
What do you think about more decentralized pockets of power? So instead of having one centralized entity, rather like 10% ruling over the entire country, you have smaller pockets of 10% ruling over smaller pockets of individuals.
Yeah, this is, in Catholic thinking, they call this subsidiarity. In the US, we call it
Mm.
federalism. There's certainly a role for that because it's part of running the experiment of learning what works and what doesn't. So if one state in the United States has better rules, people can just move there. They can vote with their feet. So you're right. There's definitely a balance between um, centralized elite control versus decentralized voting with your feet control. But at the same time, we still have Adam Smith's problem of the pin factory, which is the way you get a lot of things done is with team efforts. And sometimes those teams need to span multiple states. And it's pretty handy to have one simple set of rules that spans those states. So in the world of law, we have the Uniform Commercial Code, which means that legal transactions for businesses are pretty uniform across the United States. So when you're a Missourian doing business in Iowa, you don't need to like learn to translate everything into Cyrillic script or whatever. That's kind of simplicity of uniformity. That's a benefit. That's a trade-off if you're going to go with too much federalism.
Duly noted. Well, Garett, look, I would love to have you on again in the future to talk about more focused topics. And there's a lot that we could discuss, and we can certainly speculate, or rather, certainly brainstorm in DMs on Twitter. But I really want to thank you for taking time out of your busy day to come on and talk to your audience today. It's been a pleasure learning from you, and I think that most of us have walked away with a new nugget of wisdom during the course of this broadcast. I'm getting some thumbs up in the audience. So, yeah.
Thanks a ton, Noah. It's great being here and always glad to come back.
Cheers, Garett. Well, have a great one. Whale Coin Talk community, remember that everything you hear on these broadcasts are meant for educational purposes only. Nothing is financial advice. So be safe out there. We'll see you in about an hour for a aquarium episode, Socratic style discussion around a hot topic. So stay tuned.